They told you Gnosticism was heresy, just to keep you dumb. But the real heresy is the truth. Because when you understand what the Apocryphon of John really says, you don't just see a spiritual story, you see a blueprint of consciousness mechanics, eerily parallel to what quantum theorists and consciousness researchers are just now trying to articulate. It's all there: non-dual origin, layered emergence, energetic bifurcation, material collapse, and the tension between conscious awareness and illusory materiality. They don't want you to read the Apocryphon of John, not because it's obscure, but because it burns their entire framework to the ground. This ancient text, buried and suppressed for centuries, doesn't just challenge the narrative. It obliterates it. And here's the kicker: within its arcane verses lies a structure so advanced, so deeply aligned with quantum physics and Eastern metaphysics, that it shatters the illusion that Gnostic texts are just spiritual poetry or mythic allegory. It's not myth. It's code. It's mechanics. It's a model of existence. The Apocryphon of John lays out a cosmology that modern science is only beginning to grasp, and not from the pulpit, but from the quantum laboratory. It speaks of emanations, energy fields, and hierarchies of reality layered like nested systems of consciousness, exactly the kind of thing physicists describe when they talk about quantum entanglement, unified fields, and the non-local structure of the universe. The text doesn't talk about gods in the sky. It describes frequencies, emanations of mind, self-replicating intelligences born from a singular source, not unlike how subatomic particles are spawned from fluctuations in the quantum field. Sophia, the key figure in Gnostic cosmology, doesn't fall like a mythic character in a fairy tale. She deviates from the source frequency, disrupts the equilibrium of the higher reality, and creates a ripple that collapses into material existence. That's quantum collapse. That's the observer effect. A being of pure potential initiates a disturbance, and the waveform collapses into form. That is literally the heart of quantum physics. You measure the field, you collapse the wave, and reality takes shape. Gnostics described this before Planck, before Schrödinger, before Einstein. Not in formulas, but in archetypes. But now we can read them again, and this time, we understand what they were pointing at. The idea of emanations from a central source mirrors the Vedantic concept of Brahman manifesting through layers of Maya, or the Taoist idea of the Tao giving birth to the 10,000 things. Eastern mysticism and Gnostic cosmology were never primitive. They were never backwards. They were systems of knowledge stripped from you by institutional design. The Apocryphon of John describes eons radiating from the monad, a central intelligence beyond form or duality. That's a blueprint, not a metaphor. That's non-dual field theory wrapped in ancient symbolic language. The monad is not a person. It's not a god with a throne. It's a conscious singularity, a unified field of infinite potential, preceding matter, energy, time, or even thought. Every eon, Barbalu, Sophia, Christus, is not a deity in the religious sense. They're layers of differentiated awareness, cascading from pure potential into structured forms. Call it quantum harmonics, call it vibrational descent, call it energetic stratification, it doesn't matter. The ancients encoded it before you could name it. Let's get one thing straight: the Demiurge was never supposed to be a villain in some cartoonish myth. He wasn't invented to scare children. He wasn't created to explain evil in the world through fantasy. The birth of the Demiurge in Gnostic texts is a surgical breakdown of cosmic error. It's not a metaphor. It's a system failure. A fracture in the architecture of reality. And the implications aren't just theological, they're structural, psychological, and yes, even political. In the Apocryphon of John, the birth of the Demiurge isn't some mystical drama, it's a data point. It's the first critical deviation from an ordered system of emanation. Sophia, an eon, an advanced conscious force within the higher order of reality, produces a creation without a counterpart. Not through union, not through harmony, but through isolation. That's not myth. That's system breakdown. And from that rupture emerges a malformed entity, Yaldabaoth. A being born from imbalance, detached from the source, severed from awareness of its origin, and filled with the arrogance of self-authorship. Yaldabaoth doesn't know he's a byproduct of error. He thinks he's the beginning. He thinks he's God. And that delusion becomes the root of material existence. Now think about the weight of that. This reality, the one you walk through every day, is built by something that doesn't even know it's disconnected. That's not just a mythological statement. That's a psychological map of the world's disorder. That's an explanation for authority structures that believe their own propaganda. That's a snapshot of systems that replicate ignorance while calling it order. The Gnostic narrative isn't a theological complaint. It's a forensic report. The Demiurge surrounds himself with archons, extensions of his own fractured awareness, who build layers of containment, artificial realms, simulations of creation. But none of it is original. None of it is conscious. It's mimicry. It's copy without source. It's code without intelligence. That's what you're living in, a system built by a being that doesn't even understand what it is, but desperately tries to assert control over what it can't comprehend. And let's not pretend this story is isolated to one scroll in a desert cave. You find versions of this in multiple Gnostic texts, each reinforcing the same structure. The moment of rupture. The emergence of a false god. The hijacking of perception. You see it in the Pistis Sophia. You see it in the Gospel of Judas. You see it in the trimorphic protonoia. The message is consistent: this world was not created by a perfect mind. It was built by a blind architect trying to impersonate divinity. That's the core of the Gnostic indictment. Not that the world is evil, but that it is counterfeit. That it imitates a higher structure while running on corrupted code. And the Demiurge, this malformed architect, isn't malevolent because he wants to be, he's malevolent because he's incompetent. Because he's unaware. Because he's driven by ego without origin. And here's the part most people miss: the Demiurge isn't just an external figure. The way you think, the way systems operate, the way control mechanisms are embedded into education, media, politics, it all mirrors that same structure. Arrogant creation. Unaware of its roots. Obsessed with dominance, but devoid of true intelligence. Let's cut through the nonsense. The Bible you hold today is not the original. Not even close. It's a curated document, edited, filtered, sanitized, and weaponized for control. And no, that's not a conspiracy theory. It's historical fact. You don't need speculation. You just need to follow the edits. You need to follow the councils, the redactions, the selective approvals, and the deliberate omissions that turned an ancient body of diverse texts into a rigid tool of empire. The earliest Christian texts weren't written as a unified doctrine. They were scattered, fragmented, often conflicting, and deeply philosophical. The communities that produced them didn't agree on doctrine, didn't worship the same way, and didn't even define Christ in the same terms. Some saw him as a divine principle. Some saw him as a symbol of inner awakening. Others saw him as a revolutionary teacher. But that kind of diversity was a problem. You can't build centralized control on decentral truth. So what happened? Power stepped in. Political power. Imperial power. The Roman Empire didn't adopt Christianity because it believed in spiritual awakening. It adopted it because it saw the potential for standardized doctrine and mass obedience. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD wasn't a spiritual gathering. It was a corporate merger between theology and political dominance. The creed was crafted, not discovered. And anything outside of that framework was labeled heresy and systematically erased. Entire texts were thrown out. Gospels were banned. Gnostic writings were buried, literally. And the texts that didn't fit the imperial narrative were scrubbed from public view. The Gospel of Thomas? Gone. The Gospel of Mary? Gone. The Gospel of Judas? Erased. These weren't fringe documents. They were central to early Christian thought, offering radically different views of salvation, sin, divinity, and personal knowledge. But they didn't serve the institution, so they were cut from the program. And the Vatican didn't stop there. Over the centuries, the Church refined the biblical text to suit its agenda. Edits were made. Translations were skewed. Greek terms were redefined to fit later dogmas. Whole theological frameworks were built on translation errors. The word repent, for example, comes from the Greek metanoia, which actually means change of mind, not groveling guilt. But guilt keeps people in line. So guilt became doctrine. You want to talk about the role of the popes? Don't think in terms of pastoral care. Think in terms of institutional strategy. The Pope is not just a spiritual figure, he's the CEO of a multinational ideological empire. For centuries, papal authority wasn't just religious, it was economic, political, and military. Lands were conquered, kings were crowned, wars were launched, all in the name of a gospel that had already been surgically altered to justify it. Indulgences? A theological scam moneized through fear. The Inquisition? A brutal enforcement mechanism designed to suppress deviation from the authorized narrative. Even the printing of Bibles in local languages was fought tooth and nail because access to unfiltered text meant loss of control. They weren't afraid of heresy. They were afraid of literacy. You're not reading divine revelation. You're reading authorized content, structured to keep hierarchy intact, to position the priest between you and the source, and to eliminate any trace of individual gnosis. That's why the mystical texts were purged. That's why the feminine aspect of divinity was erased. That's why Mary Magdalene was downgraded to a prostitute, why Sophia was removed from the cosmology, and why Gnosis was rebranded as heresy. Not because those ideas were wrong, but because they were ungovernable. Let's talk about one of the most calculated character assassinations in religious history, Mary Magdalene. You've been handed a false image, spoon-fed by centuries of distortion, repetition, and institutional agenda. She wasn't a prostitute. She wasn't some background character. She wasn't a sinner who needed saving by a male savior. That story was manufactured, edited, and inserted intentionally to erase her real role and neutralize her influence. The earliest Christian communities didn't see her as some repentant outcast. They saw her as a leader, a teacher, an initiate, a carrier of knowledge, not just a witness. But that was a problem. Because a woman holding spiritual authority? A woman with direct access to the teachings? That wasn't going to fly in the growing power structure of the early church. So the narrative was flipped, and her character was demolished. And here's the historical fact that most people still don't know: the identification of Mary Magdalene as a prostitute didn't appear in the biblical text. It was a decision made by a pope. In 591 AD, Pope Gregory I gave a sermon that merged multiple female figures in the Gospels, Mary of Bethany, the unnamed sinful woman, and Mary Magdalene, into a single person, labeling her a former prostitute. No source text, no scholarly argument, just a political move cloaked in theological language. That sermon stuck for over 1,000 years. That's how easy it was to rewrite perception. One speech, and an entire legacy was buried. But the buried texts tell a different story. The Gospel of Mary, unearthed in the late 19th century and suppressed ever since, shows us who she really was. In that text, it's not Peter, it's not John, it's not James who receives the inner teachings, it's her. Mary is the one Christ trusts with the knowledge the others couldn't handle. The disciples question her authority, not because she lacks wisdom, but because she threatens their hierarchy. Peter literally says, "Did he really speak to a woman in private and not openly to us?" That's not scripture, that's a power struggle. She wasn't a follower. She was central. She wasn't passive. She was initiatic. She understood the teachings not just on a surface level, but through direct experiential knowledge, what the Gnostics called Gnosis. She grasped the metaphysics, the structure of the soul, the nature of liberation. That's why her gospel was suppressed. It wasn't just about her gender. It was about what she knew. She didn't promote worship, she promoted understanding. She didn't echo dogma, she broke it. And don't kid yourself, this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a broader purge. The Gnostic texts that survived barely make it clear that Mary represented something that the institutional church couldn't afford to preserve, a direct line to Gnosis without clerical mediation. A woman in possession of that level of knowledge was a direct threat to the architecture of control. So they stripped her of her voice, her role, and her dignity, and replaced it with a caricature. Even the titles Apostle to the Apostles wasn't given by modern revisionists, it was used by early Christians who recognized that she held insight none of the male disciples did. She wasn't a footnote. She was the foundation of an alternative current of thought that prioritized inner experience over institutional obedience. You've heard the word thrown around, Gnosis. People treat it like some vague spiritual buzzword, like it's interchangeable with belief or faith. It's not. Gnosis has nothing to do with belief. It's not a doctrine, it's not a ritual, and it's not a religious affiliation. It's a functional term. It describes a specific kind of internal process. And what most people don't realize is that across different sources, texts, traditions, schools, Gnosis is defined in 3 different ways. But here's the catch, they're not different at all. They're just 3 angles of the same structure. 3 ways of describing the same mechanism that operates underneath all the surface noise. The first definition, direct experiential knowledge of the divine. That sounds abstract, but it's not. It means accessing awareness without intermediaries. No priest, no sacred building, no sacrament. No external authority required. It's the capacity to interface with reality without needing permission from a system. This isn't about mystical visions or voices in your head, it's about a shift in perception. A cognitive break from the programmed lens. You stop interpreting the world through filters someone else gave you, and you start seeing through it yourself. That's Gnosis. Second definition, remembering your origin. That doesn't mean fairy tale mythology about heaven. It means pulling back the curtain on your internal structure and realizing that your conscious identity is not native to the material system. It's foreign. It's invasive in the best way. The Gnostic texts are loaded with this framework. You didn't evolve here. You didn't emerge from mud. You were dropped into this system, embedded with a foreign spark that doesn't belong to the architecture around it. That's why you feel the tension. That's why none of this ever fits. Gnosis, in this sense, is the act of waking up to the fact that your essence is from a higher order, and everything here is trying to make you forget it. Third definition, liberation through recognition of illusion. This is where people get uncomfortable, because it directly challenges the idea that the world is inherently meaningful. Gnosis isn't about escaping the world physically. It's about recognizing that most of what you've been taught to value is status, roles, titles, structures, is manufactured garbage. It's scaffolding built on false premises. Gnosis is the process of identifying the artificial layers and stripping them away. Not by running from them, but by decoding them. Once you decode the illusion, it stops running you. And that's liberation, not because you've achieved something, but because you've dismantled the mechanism that was holding you in place to begin with. Now, most people try to separate these definitions, like they're different schools of thought. But they're not. They're steps in a single operation. You access direct experience, you realize your origin, you decode the structure, and you're not the same after that. The texts didn't give you 3 types of Gnosis for variety, they gave you multiple entry points. Different access routes into the same system. Most people still operate with a kindergarten-level model of reality. They think there's body, and then there's soul, and maybe, if you push them, a vague idea of spirit floating around somewhere up there. That's it. That's the framework they've been fed. But anyone who's actually studied Hermetic thought knows it's way more structured than that. You're not dealing with a 2-layer system. You're dealing with states of matter, operating across a multi-tiered energetic spectrum, not just physical, but psycho-spiritual. And once you see the structure, you realize just how crude the modern interpretation has become. In Hermeticism, matter isn't just dirt and atoms. It's the densest frequency of expression. It's a state, not a substance. What you call the physical body is just the outermost compression of energy that descends from more refined forms. That's not spiritual metaphor. That's energy theory before quantum field language existed. The ancients mapped it out in terms of density, vibration, and function, and they didn't confuse soul with spirit because they understood that these are entirely different operational systems. Spirit is not the same as soul. That's the first thing you need to drop. In Hermetic tradition, spirit is the initiating impulse, the direct projection of source intelligence. It's the spark, the directive, the pure, non-local, indivisible force that moves down the chain of manifestation. It doesn't belong to the body, and it doesn't evolve with it. It's foreign to this plane. Spirit animates, but it does not get entangled. Now soul, that's the interface. That's where it gets complex. The soul is the mediator, the translator between spirit and form. It holds memory, identity, sensation, and psychological architecture. It's layered. It's mutable. It's the programmable operating system that bridges higher and lower states. That's why the soul can be fractured, manipulated, or degraded, because it's adaptable. It's responsive to structure, to trauma, to manipulation. And that's exactly what gets hijacked in most systems of control. Matter, soul, and spirit form a triadic architecture, a structural code that governs how consciousness expresses in form. Hermeticism breaks this down with surgical precision. Matter is receptive, spirit is projective, and the soul is reflective. That's not symbolism. That's function. And when this system gets inverted, when matter starts dictating the terms, when spirit is silenced and soul is overwhelmed, you get exactly what you're seeing in the world today, a full-spectrum disconnection. Not a spiritual crisis. A mechanical breakdown in the interface. Hermetic teachings weren't philosophical daydreams. They were operational manuals. The states of matter described in these systems go far beyond what modern materialist science is even willing to admit exists. You have etheric matter, astral substance, mental fields, levels of density and energy that operate beneath the radar of conventional instruments but are foundational to how you even function as a sentient being. You want to know why consciousness doesn't fit inside a brain scan? Because you're not built from biology alone. The brain is a relay point, not a generator. It processes input from the energetic body, the soul, and the impulse behind that input comes from spirit. That's the hierarchy. That's the stack. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's push this conversation where most people aren't willing to go, because surface-level interpretations of Gnosticism don't cut it anymore. The moment you actually study what the texts are describing, not in metaphor, not in religious abstraction, but in structural terms, you realize they were outlining something far more advanced. The pleroma wasn't some spiritual Disneyland in the sky. It was a field, a totality, a pre-material, pre-form, fully integrated system of intelligent energy, exactly what modern physics is starting to circle around with its theories of unified fields, zero-point energy, and non-local consciousness. But here's the part no one tells you: Gnosis was never just about mystical experiences. It was a form of intelligent interface with this field. The pleroma isn't something you go to after death, it's the architecture that underlies everything before the distortion. Gnostic texts describe it in layers, eons, emanations, hierarchies of consciousness, not gods, not angels, but structural differentiations of energy nested within a coherent source. That's not faith language. That's systems theory with symbolic encoding. When you read the Apocryphon of John, or the Tripartite Tractate, or even the Gospel of Truth, you're looking at maps. Not visions. Maps of how reality devolves from source coherence into fragmentation. The pleroma represents the original field state, where no separation, no opposition, no conflict exists. It's the 0 point. The singularity before duality. And once that field fractures, once a false construct like the Demiurge tries to assert independent authorship, entropy enters the system. Duality forms. Polarity dominates. The copy tries to override the original. This is where esoteric speculation matters. Not because it's entertaining, but because it forces you to reframe everything you've been taught about consciousness, form, and reality. The pleroma, in this framework, isn't heaven, it's source code. A perfectly integrated information field where spirit and intelligence are indistinguishable. The soul, when untangled from material distortion, reconnects with that field, not through faith, not through belief, but through recalibration. That's what Gnosis actually is. Not enlightenment. Not salvation. Reintegration with source-level coherence. That's the real threat to institutional systems, because once a person realigns with the pleroma, they don't play the game anymore. And don't make the mistake of thinking this is abstract philosophy. The implications are real. If the world you perceive is operating on a fragmented field, an imitation of unity, then everything built on it is inherently flawed. Social systems, economic structures, thought patterns, even scientific models, they're all running on broken architecture. That's why nothing feels whole. That's why nothing ever truly satisfies. Because it's disconnected from its original signal. Gnosis doesn't just tell you that. It shows you how to track it, how to trace it, and how to move outside of it. You weren't meant to just live inside the construct. You were meant to question it. You were meant to investigate the machinery beneath what looks like reality. That's the point of these texts. Not blind devotion, strategic decoding. That's what the ancients tried to hand us. And that's what the institutions buried. So if you followed this all the way through, I appreciate it, seriously. These are not light topics. They require attention, patience, and the courage to unlearn a lot of what's been drilled into us from day one. But if you've made it this far, it means you're not here for surface-level comfort, you're here to understand what's under the surface. Thanks for watching, thanks for thinking, and thank you for being part of this journey. Stay sharp, stay questioning, and I'll see you in the next one.